this is just a brief study to give you a brief or an introductory talk on researching a historical black community. And I'm using Covington as a prototype. And when I say historical black community, I am largely talking about communities, mostly rural communities, because I'm from South Louisiana, out near Lake Charles and area, and I grew up in a rural community, and I think those I understand the best. But I find that if you're doing cities and specific communities, for example, the 7th Ward in New Orleans, you would want to know all about Catholicism and the like. And I think it still applies. So I'm going to just see how far we can go before some of you have to dart off to class. So thank you, Dr. Robeson, for asking me. And it is my privilege to be here to talk to you about this. In studying historical African American communities and their history, I'm suggesting that you ask about culture. I'm suggesting that you start thinking prior to even looking at any part of them, that you want to look at what is culture, study it, and understand it, because oftentimes when we do histories or anything about African American communities and many marginalized communities, the first thing that many historians, and it doesn't matter which cultural group you come from, that includes African American historians, they want to start looking at their condition. I'm telling you that that's part of the story, but you're going to miss the fabric of the community if you don't understand culture and what it means in its fullest context. I researched a few discussions about culture. I just say them here because I've taken from them, but I'll just share this with you for the record. A good source, although an older source, is by Nathan Cohen, who's in the Chronicle of Higher Education, titled Culture Not Race Explains Human Diversity. The noted jurist A. Leon Higginbotham Jr., in his work In the Matter of Color, Race in the American Legal Process, the Colonial Period. Charles Hirschman, in his work, The Origins and Demise of the Concept of Race in Population and Development Review, and Nikki Lisa Cole, in her piece, What is Cultural Hegemony? And this is important, that you understand what culture is, so that you could know how to view people. As you see from the list here, and of course I'm not reading it to you because you can read yourself, but to explain that we move beyond just art. That when I was in graduate school and I wrote an essay called The Culture Class about a black community, and my professor says that, oh no, there can't be culture there. And he meant high art. He meant the classical studies. He meant anything that was culture, even though all those things are within many African American communities. But it's more complex than that. It is what it structures: behavior, thoughts, perceptions, values, goals, and so on. How do you understand a community? In how it understands itself. And so if you don't know what they think about themselves, then you cannot write a good story about them. And so you want to get into their minds. So how to do that, in essence, is in this example. Most recently, one of my fellow historians who is doing some wonderful work that also includes the histories of African American women asked me and another colleague from another university for a Zoom meeting to talk about breaking into a black community. How can I get there? I don't know these people. This person told me, who is a white American, and who said, I don't know how to get to them, get to talk to them. Could you help in telling me how to do that? So the other African American scholar and I said the same thing. Well, you need introductions, but so do we. I could not have done this on Covington for over 3 years without having introductions to the community. I didn't know the people there, especially the African Americans, and nobody would open up and talk to me about anything. And I'll just interject this one little point is that as a Southerner, as a South Louisianian, in our culture here, we view people we hadn't known or we don't know their people as strangers. And so my mother told me about a man that I had known for all of my life in my town, and she said, you know, he's a stranger. I said, but he's been here forever. I don't know this town without him. And she said, nobody knows his people. He showed up here many years ago, in essence about 5 decades before then, and nobody still knows his people. It is a hallmark of being Southern. You have to know your people as well as you, or else, as it happened when I brought who was then a boyfriend for the first time home, and the people said, we never heard of the name Baham. I don't know where those people come from. And I say, but there are lots of them where he comes from in Southeast Louisiana. And he had the same experience when he brought me to introduce me to his family. And they said, we don't know any Semiens. What kind of name is that? And that's my name. And in Southwest Louisiana, Semien is like being called Smith. There's a lot of us there. And so what they did, they came to feel better after knowing I had met his people and he had met mine on either side. To me, that's distinctively Southern. I just love that story, actually. I love talking about that to non-Southerners. So you have to have introductions. And so I had to talk to the people who asked me. The mayor opened the doors for me to meet many white Covingtonians, if you will. The school board did the same, and they opened the doors to many of the churches there. And then in the black community, the 3 or 4 black people who were standing there went ahead of me and made introductions. People were going to have to open up their stories, they'll have to share their images with me. And so in that, I got to understand their values, their morals. I got to understand their own perceptions of things and how they looked at things. I went into their homes and their churches and the like, and I sat for I don't know how long. I went so long in their churches on Wednesday night Bible study. That was unfamiliar to me. I went to Sunday services so long, someone from my own place of worship called me and asked me if something was wrong because I hadn't been there in months. So that's what you want to look at for culture. If you just look at the condition and go in with, they're all the descendants of enslaved people. Ooh, so they must have some kind of post-traumatic stress from that they descended. If you only want to look at them in terms of their economic status, where do they fit in here? And oftentimes, you all know that many African Americans are in the last 2, lower middle class as well as impoverished. So you go in there thinking about that. And they don't see themselves, all of the people, in that way. So what has imposed that on us? And that's major media, of course. I'm not a media basher. My first degree of the 3 that I have is in journalism. So I'm not a basher. I'm a student of it, continue to be a student of it. But we know its impact, right? And so we tend to believe it instead of questioning what we see. So then we see all of these elements of culture as we want to examine an African American community. And I want to tell you, this is almost any community, to be honest. But since this is the work I did, I wanted to say, what are their principles? What are their traditions? What kinds of customs that they have and the like? And yet we find that culture, according to some of the sources that I cited for you, plays out in those various ways as listed. I'm going to only take you through 3 with some of the images that I have, and I want to share with you some of which are in the book that I published, or I did, and I want you to see through those images how the people saw themselves and how they continue to see themselves. So if you want to examine a historic African American community, start with God. Not everybody is a religious person that they belong to a denomination, but even people that you might find on the street believe in God. And many of these people almost all the people I saw were Christians, because that's the dominant force. But now we see, especially since the mid to late 60s, Islam has encroached into the black community, and for quite some time, it was the fastest growing religion in the country. It was the fastest growing religion among African Americans. But in the rural South, I'm going to tell you, most people are Christian. So start with God. If you want to know about the community, understand that you must find where they go to church. And you're going to have a relationship with people in the church. And you're going to have to find their pastors, their leadership, to see that. So this research took me in all kinds of places. Some I won't be able to show you in the interest of time, but I want to tell you that from one conversation to the next, it took me in the most interesting places. I developed a relationship with the archivists over at the monastery that's north of Covington. They were so nice to open their archives, let me read all kinds of letters, because the Holy Family School that was started in Covington for black children was started by one of the monks there. So I had to go find this story there and see where they are. I had to have an introduction to the Catholic Church there, because there is no longer a black Catholic church in Covington. And so they gave me their history there. The Methodists are how the black community is at the Methodist Church, I should say, is how the black community came there. There's a church called Dowdy. Depending on who you're talking to, the people corrected me so much to say I wasn't pronouncing his name correctly, so please bear with me. It's either Dowdy or Dowdy. One of those is correct. So there's the Dowdy African Methodist Episcopal Church in Covington. And the people didn't even know who Dowdy was. Time had passed so long, even in the 20th century, they didn't even know who this guy was. But to find him, I had to go to New Orleans. Dowdy was a formerly enslaved person, freed in 1818. But the oldest black church in Covington is the Dowdy AME Church. And the Dowdy AME Church is important because, they're all important, but it was founded in 1854 in a slave state. It was later chartered in the state of Louisiana, but 1854, this is mind-boggling, because the AMEs were vehemently against slavery, and they didn't make a secret of it. How many of you have heard of Denmark Vesey or Vesey? One person, 2, 3, all the historians know all about it. So Denmark Vesey or Vesey, Charleston, South Carolina, freed because he won the lottery. Yeah, slaves played the lottery. And he freed himself by buying himself out of freedom. He was the topic, or is the topic, of a rebellion that was formed but didn't get off on to do what it was supposed to do against slavery, because somebody told about it. To make it real for you, students, I can tell you that some 2015, a young man went into a church in Charleston while the people were having Bible study, and he murdered them, murdered 9 of them. Said he left one of them so he could tell. It breaks my heart for all kinds of reasons, but when he told the police that he started not to kill them because they were so nice to him. But he did it anyway. Why is that important? Because that was Visa's church in the 19th century. So history is alive with these structures today. And so that is just one example of how the AMEs just hated slavery so much. Dowdy was freed 1818, and he met a man named Reverend Jordan Early, who introduced him to the AME church. He was Methodist, and then he went to the AME, which is the African American part of the Methodist church. And he founded the historic St. James AME Church in New Orleans. It's on St. Roman Street in New Orleans. It's still there. Oftentimes when you see movies with a church background, that's the church they're using. And it was founded by this guy. So 1854, for them to found, and the St. James Church was 1848. 1844 chartered, I think 1848. For this to happen in Louisiana is just amazing during the antebellum period. So I had to go find Dowdy in New Orleans to tell the people in Covington all about him. And in that, I found this image of him. The second oldest church, black church in Covington is called the First Missionary Baptist Church, founded in 1891. Why is it important? It was the first Baptist presence in Covington. I got in a little, someone let me in on a little controversy because they said, well, the First Baptist Church said, they don't know about this. So I had to make sure I pulled all of the documents out of the courthouse in Covington to show that this church, the First Missionary Baptist Church, was the first time a Baptist church and presence was made in Covington. And so they lived with it. It was chartered later in 1898. Records are all in Covington there. And so you want to know where it is? If you know where the courthouse is in Covington, if you're standing at the courthouse, I guess in the front, if you just look to your left, depending on which direction you are, you look to your left, there's a little church sitting there in the next block, and that's the First Missionary Baptist Church. And the third oldest church, it was Mount Zion Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church founded in 1907. The emphasis here on religion is what is called the baptism of James Barney. Over and over, records show, whatever written records I could find, but also through oral history, that the people recall going down to the Columbia Street landing on the Bogafalaya River. And sometimes they would also have the people of various denominations. So it could be Baptist or Methodist, whichever church believed in immersion, they would go and get baptized there. I thought that was a very powerful image. And this group, that's the pastor sitting there. You can tell which one he is, can't you? Here it is an example of all of the kinds of the different groups of people who were involved in the church. And over, I tell you what, this is a little stretch of land in Covington. They call it the West 30s. And they must have, I think, about 10 or 11 different churches within a mile or two radius. So, and they're still actively going there. This is the Reverend H.B. Black. He was a native of Beaumont, Mississippi. And what I found in Covington is that Covington is not the Francophone culture that south of it is. Covington is a distinctly Anglo culture. And also, because of, which is an entirely different story, but because of the lumber industry that first was in the Northeast, then the Northwest, then moved down to this area and destroyed much of our natural yellow pine, longleaf, yellow longleaf pine trees. And believe me, I went out and talked to horticulturalists. I went to find out what's going on with that. That in much of where you live now, it's not natural. Those trees had to be imported here from South Carolina to rebuild the forest. But Reverend Black is one example of the many people who are brought here from parts of Mississippi to work in the lumber industry. So it's not unusual to find Mississippians. And so I had to keep asking the people to beg my pardon because sometimes I didn't understand what they were saying. And it's because you have their language is mixed up with dialects from various parts of Mississippi and some from south of them in Mandeville and Madisonville, from Slidell, and so I had to kind of figure out. But guess what? Immersion works because I started figuring it out. And so you can see here with some of the congregation. This is Miss Georgia Plowman, also a good, I want you to take a look at her, not just her face, but what she has, how she is dressed. She's dressed for church. She went to church with her Bible. But look at what you see she's holding in her right hand. She embodies, this image embodies that of an elder, a woman elder, whose dress is very modest. Hats are very important still to many African American women. There's a wonderful text that is it was published not too long ago. It's called Crowns, Portraits of Black Women in Church Hats by Michael Cunningham and Craig Marbury. It tells that story through images of black women in church hats. And they quote Paul. I'm not a biblical scholar, so I can't tell you exactly where it is now, but they quote Paul and how these women rely on this notion of having their heads covered when they go in such a sacred place. Not all black women, of course, but many still do. She is someone that the church would hold and did hold in high esteem. In some black churches, you need to know, in many of them, particularly in Baptist churches, Pentecostal churches, and the like, there's usually one woman who's chosen as the mother of the church. Well, this woman was passed on by the time I was doing this research, but there were others who spoke so highly of her. She was honored by the Greater Starlight Baptist Church with that title. She has often have to have longevity. The mother of the church is not the youngest woman in the church, not a middle-aged woman, meaning in her 50s or so. This is an elder who has lived their lives that would say that they had high moral standards. It does not mean that they have been perfect. It does not mean that they did not have challenges. It does not mean that they didn't have personal issues and the like. What it does mean is their life shows how they overcame all of this with dignity and respect. So they will have had high moral standards by this time. They represent piety, integrity, caring for others, wisdom, sacrifice, and other characteristics of modern standards. They also have the authority to speak to others about their failings. Just quickly, my husband and I were invited to a Baptist church somewhere in the woods outside of Slidell, and a lady that he's known all his life was standing. We were sitting there waiting for the program to start. It was a Black History program, and a young woman was sitting in front of us with a little child, like maybe not quite a toddler. The mother of the church came up and talked to her while we were sitting there. She said to this woman, "You are such a lovely woman, and you can do great things, but the man with whom you're associated is not good for you. He's not your husband, and if he can't respect you more, she said, move on. The mother of church can do that. Anybody else? You might get told off and the like, but the mother of the church has that kind of authority because of the life they've lived. The next part is family. Family is important. You have to understand how family builds the culture and how people in each of the families contribute to it. There is a saying, I'm sure you know, the aggregate, I should say, of a nation is built on its families. The sum total of the nation is the family. And here you will find in historic black communities, the family. And although I'm emphasizing the historic black community because that's where I've been researching, but it still exists. But you won't find it if you're going to look for the stereotypes you see on the news. You got to find the people and talk to them and understand them how they understand themselves. So here, this is a 19th century image that the people only let me hold if I promised with everything I could. They just didn't make me swear on the Bible that I would scan it and get it back to them, because this is the only image that they have of Ida Thomas and Will E. Thomas in 1920s. This image tells a lot because it was taken by traveling photographers who went around. You'll see many families of all cultures, and I want you to note, I am staying away from the term race because there's no such thing as this biological construct, so I don't want that image in this discussion. We'll talk about it as a social construct, if you will, but culture is what makes us who we are, everybody. You'll see these kinds of images of many people, especially in the early 20th century, because many of them they get in their best clothes, and the traveling photographer was in town or traveling around, and he'd stop and take their photographs, and they'd buy it from him. And so that's what happened in this image. You'll see them standing straight, and you'll see them that they're putting their best feet forward. Guess what Will E. Thomas's work? He was a laborer, a general laborer, which was what most, and I can say with some certainty, most African Americans were doing late 19th into the 20th century. But on the census record for 1920, guess what his occupation was listed as? Baseball player. And some of the images I did not put here was to show you that there were a good number of them. Covington had a vibrant league among the black leagues, and there's a lot of research. Everything I'm telling you, I hope that if you consider research, that you just take off and do it, okay? I'd love to do it all myself. I just don't have the time and space and can't do it. But the baseball look. Okay, so many of you may not know Isaiah Robinson. Who knows Isaiah Robinson? Yeah, okay. Well, he was killed in a horrible car accident in Texas. Maybe about, listen, COVID is making me forget time here, like what happened before COVID and so on. But maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, he is one of the stars from Covington. Played football at Southern, and then he was a standout with the Los Angeles Rams. And he played with them a long time. He was from Covington. His father was Sonny Robinson. And Sonny Robinson was one of the best baseball players that the people there told me that could be. Sonny Robinson had a relationship with the community. He became a top seller for Seagram's liquor, he and a business partner. They had a club in Covington, and that club was very popular, had all of the people that my generation and perhaps yours know went around on this, what they call a chitlin circuit, because they went to poor black clubs, whether they served that or not. But James Brown and all these people, my husband's father says that he remembers going there and places like that in St. Tammany Parish so that they could hear these artists who were becoming popular. Nobody passed through here without going to Sonny Robinson's club. He also had a close relationship, and I wish I could have shown you the image that I got from the, it's a warehouse, warehouse store in Covington, white owned by brothers, passed down in their generation, right off one of the main streets. They're the one who gave me the image of the baseball team with Sonny Robinson. And they said he and their dad were the closest of friends. Did a lot of things together. So this man was not an anomaly, he was good. Next is talking about extended families. If you look at the census records from 1870 to 1940, those that are available, you'll see that African American families lived in extended family households, or they lived very close to each other. I often tell my students, who are largely African American, that when, they are accustomed to hearing all these criticisms about the black community, and so they believe it in many ways. They see it, they see all these things and the like, but that African Americans lived in extended family households. And I hope that you come to a study of them to understand that. The former pastor at Greater Starlight Baptist Church, well revered in Covington, told me this. He said, listen, and he was in his 60s. He said, in segregation, we went to school. There were no special ed classes. There were no short buses. There was no sending a child home who misbehaved. None of that, because it was taken care of at school. And the teachers, the family members, and others, they either went to one of those churches together, they were in social organizations together, they knew each other. And so here with these extended families, this image is so cute, I think. It's Ms. Luella Williams with her young grandson, Willie Walter Lewis Davis. And look at what Miss Ella Selman, this is her grandmother, she said that the boy wouldn't go anywhere without his dog. And so you'll see that his father was a painter, a cement finisher, and a local medicine man. His mother was a cook as a domestic for a family in Covington, and his sister, Ella Selman, you may have heard of her. Sometimes she looks like she's everywhere in the world out in these parts, but she is a leading civic person in St. Tammany Parish. I love all these images, but this is my favorite one. I call it the antics of Curtis Ray Davis. Look at all these women. They have to uphold their status as mothers and grandmothers and aunts. Look how serious they are. Is Curtis Ray Davis serious? And they told me that just before the person took the picture, Curtis decided to do this little thing. And one of them said, who remembers, said that they were all trying not to laugh at Curtis because that would mean that they approved of his behavior, but they thought it was. Family, this is the Randall family. The matriarch, Miss Marie Randall, was there with her children and their spouses, and so you'll see them here. One of the Randalls, the sons, became a contractor, a builder in Covington. He built homes, and that was only when in Covington black people could finally get loans from a credit union. that to a black couple, and none other than Walter Percy. Do y'all know him? Yes. Who worked with them, and he had another friend who was a lawyer, a prominent white lawyer, and some other black families, and they came together and started a credit union so that black people could borrow money to build homes. If you go into a historic rural, particularly black community, and you see a lot of the homes are in great disrepair, have long been there are stories behind that. And one for much of the 20th century was that they could not borrow money, they could not get a mortgage, and so they had to build with what they had. They'd have to gather with what they had. And this is the extended Randall family. This was, again, very common. Her husband was a pastor, and you'll see all of their children and grandchildren. I think there are a couple of aunts and uncles in this image, rounding up this whole family is there. Here's a wedding. On either side, both the groom and the bride's fathers had died not too long before their wedding date. I think this was 1968. I think the groom's father died the year before. And in their stead were the godfathers of the groom and the bride. So you see the bride's mother, but standing next to her is her godfather, who stood in for her father. And on the end is his godfather, standing in for his mother. And this is, I thought, a cute photo, the Bradford family. Look at the little boy in his suit. And this implies that, or suggests that they either had come from or were going to church. I should have changed that around to say they were going to or had come from church. The education of Covington's community. So Julius Rosenwald, he established the fund. And it's a wonderful quote from him that I won't read to you, but I'll paraphrase. He said, "Unless the Negro is given opportunities or seizes the opportunities to move forward as full citizen, the nation will not move forward." That's a paraphrase from Julius Rosenwald. And you all know that this Julius Rosenwald is the one who took over Sears and Roebuck. And this is the one who made Sears what Sears used to be. And so he developed the fund to help to build schools in black communities, primarily across the South. As I said earlier, he worked with Booker T. Washington, and Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee University very early on, and then as they move forward, after Booker T. Washington dies in 1915, the black student architects and other professional architects were the ones to build those Rosenwald schools. They're just amazing. For those of you who are interested in the history of architecture, you'll see how they designed the schools for maximum use of the climate. That is, the windows were set so that they could have a breeze. They were set so that the sun would come in through there because they didn't always have electricity, and they were raised and the like. And so, in 1924, this guy, Professor James Harrison, arrived and set up the school. He came from Mississippi with his wife, Luberta, found his image and hers and their entire story about their personal lives from a daughter-in-law who lives in Baton Rouge. So I got to go all kinds of places. I was just, my little Ford Escape has over 360-some thousand miles on it. And it's, what is it this year? It's about 16 years old now. And so it's still working pretty well. But I found his image, and the people there still talk about and remember Professor Harrison. In many African American high schools, principals were called professor, not as an imaginative title. Many of them did have graduate degrees. The historians here probably know that until mid-70s or early 70s, Louisiana was one of southern states that would pay for the tuition for a black person who could enter, who could pass all the admissions exams and everything for schools outside of the South. There were principals and teachers at segregated black schools who had PhDs, who had master's degrees, and many of them came from schools in the Midwest or the Northeast. Some of the schools you call the great schools, or if you're like Purdue students where I went to graduate school, they used to call Harvard the Purdue of the East. And so we'll say the Southeastern schools of the outside of the South, since we're here. And so he was called Professor. Professor Harrison came to Covington with his wife and his two sons, twins, Elton and Lincoln, both of whom earned PhDs. One of them was a professor and then later an administrator at Southern University, Baton Rouge, and the other one was the same at Dillard. Their emphasis and their degrees were in science and math. And the people today tell you that Professor Harrison emphasized what we call the STEM subjects today, because he himself was a mathematician. And his wife, who was a pianist, they balanced each other out. They had arts and science. That sounds like my household as well today. Pardon me. This was the first graduating class of the Rosenwald School. And as you know, many of these schools were, many schools in the South and in Louisiana went to 11th grade until I think what was in the late 40s or something, they added a grade. But this was the first graduating class, and they're standing there in Covington. And this is my last slide, and then if you have any questions about any of the other areas here, I'd be happy to address them. But these are commemorative plaques about the Rosenwald School and then the dedication to Professor Harrison. In summary, I want to tell you that through these images and through many more like them and through the stories, through the lives, if you are writing about African Americans, write about culture, you want to know how they address things in their everyday lives. You want to know about their religion, you want to know about how they think about education and all those things, but you also want to know about their social structures. Within segregated black communities, there are people of various means, but they all lived in the same community. And so there were people who had more than others and some in between, but they had shared values. In those shared values, you have what we might call the historic African American community. And I want to say to you that if you neglect that, you're going to write the same old story. You're going to give the same rendition. They were enslaved, and this is what white people did to them. They were free, then Jim Crow, and so on and so forth. Get to know the people, get to know their communities. In other words, get into their heads. And then you can write an accurate and clear story of the people. Thank you.